Hi, Glenn here. So today's bonus episode is a very important episode, and I hope each and every one of you take the time to listen to it. It's focused on an extremely unpleasant topic. It was very difficult for me to sit through and have this conversation with Rani Hong, who I spoke to on stage at the Washington Hospitality Association's annual meeting in October. Now, Rani Hong is important to listen to because she's a survivor of child trafficking and has become one of the world's leading voices in the fight against modern-day slavery. She was taken from her family at age 7, if you can believe that. Robbed of her childhood, sold into slavery. It's almost too much to bear. And this interview is almost a little bit too difficult to hear, but each and every one of you need to hear it because in the hospitality industry, you're on the front lines to prevent this from happening to anyone else. It's up to you to make a difference. And this is an interview where you learn some of the things to look out for and how you can make a difference and how you might be able to help save someone's life. No joke. It's just that important. I hope that you learned something. Let me know what you think. Drop me a line at Traveling Glenn on Instagram and Twitter. Or just send me a note, glenn@rouse.media, or on our Facebook page. I hope you find this interview interesting and informative, and thanks so much for giving it a shot.
Do you live, eat, and sleep the hotel industry? Looking to brush up on your game? You've come to the right place. Welcome to No Vacancy, the hospitality industry's #1 podcast, with your host, Glenn Hausman.
I want to thank all of you for listening and Ronnie for sharing such an incredible story. And before we open it up for questions, I just wanted to speak maybe for a couple of minutes for you. And I do want to let you know that this part of the session is actually being recorded for my No Vacancy podcast. So we'll be able to review it, everything we talk about here today that gives you practical, actionable insight will be able to be recorded. So if you want to get on that mailing list, again, text 66866 with the word hotel. You'll be on the mailing list, and then you'll be able to get this session. So enough for the plugs. I got to tell you, I've been in this business now for 20 plus years, and this may be the hardest conversation I've ever had in this business. But it's a conversation that needs to be done and needs to be had, right? But I got to first say I'm amazed at the person you have become and that you've overcome so much. How do you go from a place of such horror to being an inspiration to everybody in the world to try to drive this forward?
Right. First of all, it is, can you imagine, very difficult.
It's difficult for me just to hear it, let alone to think about living it.
Well, and it's one thing, and so as a victim, as that 7-year-old child, often now as an adult, I go back to that. It's like, oh my goodness, how could this happen to a 7-year-old child? And yes, very difficult to hear some more. I didn't go into details more in depth, but difficult to hear what we did here, right? We all need to admit that, we all know it. And so for me, as myself, very difficult. Mm-hmm. However, there was a circumstance in my life that when I traveled back to India, by the way, what I did different, I traveled back to India after 21 years and miraculously found my birth mother from a hotel. I forgot that portion of the story, so there is good news there is hope. But I would go back to India, and as I tried, and I went visit a shelter. I listened to a young woman tell me her story, and she told me, nobody ever hears my story. Nobody lets me discuss what it is. And she wanted to be empowered. Right. So from that day forward, I knew I myself as an individual can do one thing. And I told her, and I made a promise to her, I will carry your voice throughout the world. I will remember you, I will remember your story, and I will carry your voice so others might hear your plea. So that, to me, it inspires me that I'm not alone, first of all. I'm not alone. Right. It inspires me. There are a million. We know the numbers of 40 million. So those are very much, but again, I think every day it's a choice, as we all need to make choices in life, and we all make choice in how to overcome our obstacles and how do we overcome our challenges. And so that is a daily thing that I must do. But in the end, I see the vision, the goal I want. And as long as I keep at that focus, that helps me.
I bet that brings you a lot of peace to know that you've made real difference in people's lives too.
It does give me very much of a peace to saying, there is change. But I think what's more, it's on and off, right? I mean, one day you're like, oh my goodness, this thing is not moving forward. The next day, past the 193 countries voted on a World Day Against Trafficking in Persons, which I launched a few years ago. So every July 30th is the day that we celebrate. I went before the UN General Assembly and said, I just need one day to give a voice to victims. And 193 countries voted yes, give that day. So every year, July 30th, in fact, this is one thing we can talk about, maybe plan for the next July 30th. How can you as an association do something to raise awareness on that day? So when I see those successes, it inspires me, okay, go to the next day, go to the next event, and do education.
Right.
But when I see action within a certain industry and I see the success of it, that is what inspires me. And then when I see a woman or child being changed and rescued, that also inspires me to go continue.
Right, I bet it does, and I bet it adds an extra level of meaning to what you went through to be able to help all of these other people and give you that drive that you need.
Yes, I have met with many victims around the world.
Right.
Again, as I traveled, I listened to their stories. I traveled, running a shelter of my own, but hearing the voice of those, and when you really get to know them, and they are just regular young people.
Right.
And they would tell me these horrific stories, but yet I knew there could be a change that could happen. And everyone has a different story, right? It's not a cookie cutter kind of thing that's one story fits all. Every individual former victim has their own story, and very powerful story. And so that's why I say today, I speak for those without a voice, representing the millions who don't have that voice.
What strikes me is people just probably don't believe that something like this is happening, number one, here in the United States, and number two, in Washington, and possibly in your own hotel, like she had that experience over there. So I feel that there must be a lot of recognition that this is absolutely a real issue, and then when you see something, it could actually be something. How do we get people over that hump of their own internal disbelief that this could be happening right under their own noses, and then to take action without fear that they're making some terrible mistake and misreading the situation?
Right, absolutely. I've identified a big challenge we have, right? We all have that challenge, and oftentimes, especially here in our culture here, thinking, okay, it's an overseas problem, it happens over there, it doesn't happen here. However, when I did a video for Washington State, and very specifically will show you the routes that is happening right here in our state, right here in the Seattle Everett area. And so, one, I think we just need to stop and admit there's a problem.
Right.
That to me is a huge progress, right? And I am starting to see big companies and CEOs stand and make a commitment saying, yes, this is an issue in my realm of influence. However, I'm going to take that action. I'm going to put policies in place. I'm going to put codes of conduct that says zero tolerance for modern day slavery. I'm going to be doing things that we've put in the Freedom Seal as a criteria. So we've come a long ways. Again, 18 years ago, this was a taboo subject, not talked about. Today, this is like one of the major issues in our time. In the 21st century, we're talking about trading of human beings.
Right. I mean, again, absolutely shocking to me. And one of the things that I'm having a hard time understanding is you obviously have been through it, so you have an extra sense towards these situations. And you mentioned the situation that you had in Romania with that waitress who's ultimately very timid. I think that if I was just in a hotel, and a nice high-end quality hotel, it wouldn't even come into my frame of reference to even think that. And I think that's another area that needs to be changed. So how do you interpret the signs of somebody who's being timid or shy, or may be serving you as someone who's just not, I would think maybe they're just a disconnected person that's not interested in serving, as opposed to somebody who's going through a profound life crisis.
Right. So to go back to my story in Romania, that totally took me off guard, obviously, as I landed there. But I was with a group of women, probably 10 women who was with me, and we're all at the restaurant, right? And I'm the only one saying, wait, something's not right. The 9 others didn't see anything wrong. And so I'm starting to say things, but of course, my own experience and working on this, I can identify fairly easy what's going on.
Of course.
But the 9 others didn't. And so as I was talking and I was trying to figure this out, I was educating my own team. right? Educating them and started to saying, and we were there probably a week or so, and by end of that week, these women were all trained on this issue. And at the end of the day, they would go back to the restaurants like, oh my goodness, she's right, look at this. Why is there a limousine coming across, dropping off 2 people, and they're going up to the restaurant? And not just one instant, but happening every 30 minutes. Something is going on there, right? Even at the high levels using the location.
Right.
So I think that is where absolutely is being able to educate the people around us in our own hometown.
Right. I think that the next big issue is really that, at least for me, and maybe we all kind of think this way, or maybe we don't, that we only think that this is happening at some cheap, unbranded roadside hotel and not a 3, 4, or 5-star type of property. You know, how can we better recognize that this is a problem that could potentially happen in any hotel?
Absolutely, and that's the key.
Yeah.
It could happen anywhere, any nation, any place, right? So we're not just putting it in a box. And so, and amazingly, we are finding trafficking victims and trafficking situations, 5-star, 4-star hotels. That's why, and again, I want to mention some names here, but pretty big brands, probably represented in this room, are taking very active role. But I think that's where we think often it's these little hotels where nobody's watching. Yes, it occurs there, absolutely, and the way it happens is different than how it's happening in the 5-star hotel.
Right.
But you see the numbers coming through the 5-star, 4-star hotels, restaurants, and these facilities. It is astonishing that this is still happening.
It really is, and to me, that's just a huge wake-up moment right now. So are there any obvious signs that you might be able to pick up on to identify the problem before you start to probe a little bit deeper?
Yeah, and so I think, again, I come back to the receptionist, but there's also, if your staff, your employees probably see and hear a lot of things, right?
Right.
We don't always know. And believe, this is why you want to take action, because there are actual tools being given to staff, employees, to be able to report incidences. So this is why we as an industry need to be on top of this thing and be proactive before something else happens.
Right.
But there are tools now being given to staff, employees, to able to identify somebody walking down the hallway, right? What's different, what's not, and you're not going to just go up and accuse them, right? Hey, that's what's going on.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I would think, I don't know how comfortable I would be, because what if I'm wrong, and what if my employer then is angry about that?
Yeah, and that's a very real, right? That's a real thing that could happen. So I think we need to be, again, that's why we need to put the tools at the management level. If the managers are trained and they got the tools to be empowered to change, then they're going to be much more happier and easier to work with their employees and staff, right? So when a staff member comes, okay, we listen, we take into every situation, and then we find out, is there something here that we didn't see? Do we go back to the registration, and is there clues there? So there are things and analytics and things like that are now we're able to help you to identify the number of potential risks of human trafficking within your facility.
At what point do you move it beyond a hunch into involving law enforcement?
Yeah, first of all, I think we're all adults here. I speak at high school, but don't ever confront right there, right? You take it to management, you take it to law enforcement. Law enforcement is there to help as the best they can. We're training them as well. But I think that the point is, if something isn't right, just go and talk to your manager, to your boss. At least you did your part. If they decide not to listen, that's something they need to live with. But at least I did what I could to voice my opinion and to bring this to the forefront.
Right. So what are some of those signs that you think that are more obvious that we could pick up on in the hotel experience? You say walking down the hall and seeing somebody. So what am I seeing that's going to trigger that first reaction that previously I may have initially discounted, but now I need to pay a little bit more attention to?
And so just using my example, I was sitting in the foyer of the hotel in Romania, okay? Just talking with some people and things. And I saw this happening. I mean, I would see the limos and I see these cars, very rich cars, coming in, dropping off some girls and such. I would see that and I think, okay, well, different. I'm in a different country. I'm in a different culture. I don't know. But as I had sitting there having conversation, over time and time again, that was happening. So I knew, wait, this is just very unusual. You know when things are unusual, and
Right.
you question it. You do question it, and for me, I was able to, at first I didn't identify it, right? But it was through these patterns of I see over and over again, then I started realizing, wait, there are certain things and way people are being brought in and where they're going. And all of them went right to the restaurant, and what I didn't tell you, there was an office right next to the restaurant, so the people would come into the office and sign in. And I'm going, that's unusual. We don't really do that here. And I'm coming from the American culture of, I haven't seen that. So that was different, but then time after time, why do they keep reporting to this man behind a desk at the office, and then once they did that, then they could go into the restaurant to have food. So there was a clue.
Right.
So that's when I started asking, just curious, what was that all about?
Do you think it's harder for people to identify when a boy or a man is in that situation as opposed to a female victim, because we may just discount that something could be happening this to a male more easily?
Yeah, no, great question, and I didn't really address the gender issue. And so, I would think it might be easier to identify the woman and the girl.
Right.
However, there need to be much more education on, especially when it comes to the hospitality industry, there are a lot of male that are being trapped in this industry. And so I think we do need to do a shift in being able to recognize both genders. However, we seem to think, it is more women and girls statistically, but I think it's because the male numbers are not being reported.
Right.
Again, numbers are numbers, and we do the best, and we come out with these numbers, but again, we got to look at these.
Right, because if something is hidden below layers that we're not focused on, then we don't even know what to track in order to create accurate numbers from that.
Right.
Right.
And so I think this is where and in, I think 2004 or so, I worked with the U.S. government, U.S. Department of Health and Human Resources, and we launched we launched a campaign, a USA campaign, hidden beneath, look beneath the surface. And that was just a social campaign, but that really helped to really bring that issue forward and to be then gave actual steps to identify.
Excellent. I think this might be a good time to open it up for questions. So anyone have a question out there that they'd like to ask? Obviously, it seems like we could talk about anything at this point. No? I'm sure someone has a question. There's a lot of smart people out here that want to do the right thing. No? Yep. Thank you, sir. Here comes a microphone for you. Please speak in that so we can hear you.
Tony. So in Washington, people who are, I guess, in the hotel industry, we have to be careful that we're not employing anybody that's, comes to us through some other. I think most of us have pretty good safeguards in place for that. And then there's the whole supply chain. Are we buying products from people who are, potentially being forced into labor? But more importantly, how are people being used in Washington State? Is it the sex industry? Is it agriculture? Where are people really getting used? We can obviously play a role in trying to stop the transfer of people, but I'm not sure. I think that's probably the most common intersection of where we end up interacting with this, because I don't think most of us are hiring them. So I'm just trying to understand where we can make the biggest impact. Being aware of it is great. By the way, we've done training at our hotel looking for this, but I'm just trying to figure out where this is actually happening, where people are getting used.
Right. So right here, specifically in Washington State, one, we know we are a border to an international border. We know we're close to the proximity of the waterways. And so those are two escape routes, you might say, and then people coming in. So we have both sex trafficking and forced labor. The sex trafficking is much easier to identify, and we hear about it, and we're able to see rescues and things like that. But at the same time, forced labor is thriving in our state. One example is, let me put it away, workers are being brought here, whether being brought into Washington State or workers within Washington, and they are taken to remote places throughout Washington State, Shelton, which is more towards Olympia, Eastern Washington, and they are being put in these like mobile homes. So they get an employment contract. They get an employment contract to work somewhere, but then outside of that employment contract, they're taken to isolation places within our state. Sex trafficking and forced labor occurs at the same time. And there's camps that this is occurring. So maybe you say, okay, that doesn't matter to me as much because I'm the hotel. And so, but I think we got to look at where are we located. Location, if you're in Seattle, you're going to see a lot of sex trafficking. But when you start looking in the forced labor, when the products that we have in our hotels, a lot of those things are tainted by or made by slaves in a foreign country. And again, tools to be able to help you track that stuff. Right. So it happens in both ways. I think we are not different than any of the other states, but we are close to those two escape routes. What we need to look at specifically, I go more detail on the transit and the routes that the victims are coming in. And a lot of your places are a point of meeting. The hotels, the airports, the restaurants are a point of contact, first point of contact to meet the victim. Once they meet there, then, just like in the story, then they take them to wherever they are in Washington State. So I think that's where we need to be. You are in the front lines, and you're, first one in contact. And you may not necessarily, this takes a lot of training, right, to be able to identify that. So you may not be able to identify that at first, but once you start seeing again, and you're getting more training and more specific training, education, I think these are things that you're aware of. And then after a few times, you're like, oh my goodness, okay, this is something that needs more investigations.
Right.
But it absolutely happens here in our state. What we did through research, through the task force, I believe was several counties in Washington State are affected by human trafficking. We know those numbers, and they're difficult to get, and then we also know about garages, businesses now opening up in garages of people's homes. You wouldn't think anything of it, but there was one instance that King 5 covered that workers are being brought and they were kept in the garage to make the linen stuff. And then guess who they're selling them to is people within Washington State.
Right.
So those are things we can look at.
That brings up two issues for me that I think warrants a little bit deeper dive. Number one is the supply chain. I know a lot of hoteliers out there are very focused, for example, on environmental issues and ethical issues, and aren't just worried about, like what I said yesterday about the towel in the room and not washing it, but actually understanding how that towel might be made, where it comes from, that factory that it actually comes from, and understanding who is making those products within the factory. So I think maybe what we're talking about here is when these folks are making contracts with suppliers, they get a better understanding on where the product is being made and who is making those particular products, right?
And that's not easy, right? It's not easy to identify.
It's becoming easier because the good conscience companies are doing the work already, so there should be certain mechanisms in place when you're dealing with certain companies. And perhaps you urge companies that aren't doing it to get a better idea of where their supply chain is, to give you as the hotelier a sense of comfort and peace when you're buying their products.
And that's where the Freedom Seal comes in, because again, we're giving very specific criteria, very actionable things that you can do.
Right.
And yes, you start looking at the contracts that you have with suppliers. Who are they? Are they ethical suppliers? Where are they getting? And it takes a little bit of homework, right? It's not just something that's seen. And to the point that this is becoming such an issue that I think we have about 7 countries who have passed laws on regulations on this, because so it's just a matter of time that businesses have to, by law, step up to the plate and start showing concrete action. I know, again, I work a lot in the UK, and the UK Modern Slavery Act absolutely outlines all of this stuff.
Right.
So we're seeing a lot of businesses really taking proactive steps.
Excellent. And I think it's probably something that's going to be driven more by business than government.
Absolutely. And that is why I'm here, because I want it to be driven by businesses, right? Because you know how this works. You're in it every day. And it's often governments are trying to put these restrictions and guidelines, but they're not always on the ground. So we, as a society, we rather have the association, the businesses drive this leadership. That is my first ask.
Right.
Once we do that, then everything else is, versus having it the other way around. It just doesn't, it's not as effective.
So how can we better identify, for example, prostitution that might be taking place in a property and how that connects to illegal sex trafficking?
Yeah, and I think that's where I believe there has been a lot of education here through the association. Again, easy way when it was with the hotel, again, looking at the signs that I had mentioned before, looking for those signs. I think, again, one of the top employees is that reception desk. That reception desk receives a lot of data, receives a lot of information. So really getting them trained to identify and know who to report to, know what to do is something that we absolutely need to equip.
That's a pretty big responsibility for someone who may be a college student working at 2 in the morning, for example.
And that's a good point, because a lot of the trafficking, now in the sex trafficking, prostitution, I know best came out with us to take 2 p.m. in the afternoons where a lot of the sex trafficking is happening within the industry. 2 p.m. in the afternoon when people are working, because a lot of it is, 2 weeks ago I back at another event at the United Nations, trade in minors. And we went very specifically trade in minors in the digital age. And so that's all to do with sex trafficking.
Right.
But that's where your training will help, and it's easier to identify, but it's not always easy to report it. And sometimes when you do report it, it doesn't move forward, but doesn't mean you don't need to report it. I think what we need to do, one of the biggest gap is data, right? Collecting the data, what type of statistics, what kind of trafficking, what kind of circumstances happened.
Right.
Getting that kind of data will really be helpful in moving this forward.
Right. All right, I think we have time for one more question, should there be one in the audience. I know you're so eager before. We have one more? All right, run, Tony, run.
What information do you have about the transit patterns in eastern Washington? I mean, we've got people here from Ellensburg and Spokane and Moses Lake and everything like that. Are those hotels also a big factor in this? Is that something we need to watch for? Are people being moved through Washington into nearby states?
So I live in Washington State, and I often, first thing is Seattle. I think of Seattle. However, what we know from reports, what we know from research, it's maybe a meeting place, but then fast, they're taken to eastern Washington. This industry is thriving in eastern Washington. We just don't hear about it, we don't hear the statistics, and we don't hear it in the news. However, this is why the crime flourishes in eastern Washington. So I would need to look at, as an association, what are we doing to train the hotels in that area. I'm not sure how much has been done, but I would, if I had to guess, probably more trafficking is happening over there, out of sight, out of mind, kind of thing. And so that's where this industry thrives in profits, and because nobody's looking over there. So that is why one of the reasons why I am working more and focused specifically on the forced labor issue is just unreported. However, we do know it is absolutely happening there, and we have cases and work on that.
Excellent. So again, if you want to hear this interview again, just text the word hotel to 66866. And as we wrap up, I would love for you to give us that call to action. How can people get more information, not just for folks in this room, but for people who are going to listen to this subsequently, to become involved so they can help make a difference?
Yes, one way can do online. Again, online, Adopt the Seal. AdoptTheSeal.org will give you an area to make a pledge to take action. That is one. Two, training. If you have not done training within your industry and within a hotel, I encourage you to do so. Again, locally, the association is doing that. On the corporate level, we are bringing in corporate training to the big brand names, which gives very much more half a day to a day training specifically. So two, do that. Number three, I think able to just, if you can make a commitment, again, just a commitment to doing the right thing, commitment to take action, pledge, adopt the seal, the Freedom Seal is a component, and that really is a tool to really help you to do this. It's not just research and all this kind of stuff. This is actual practical things that I created to help businesses do the right thing. So from monitoring your supply chain to monitoring places that you may get in contact. Again, there are a lot of tools out there, and we can bring that to your situation to be able to help identify and forced labor, more likely prevent it and be proactive versus reactive.
Excellent. I love it. Rani, I mean, what can I say? You are an absolutely amazing person again, and an inspiration to us all. And thank you for shining such a bright light on this subject and helping to make a difference. Let's hear it for Rani Hong. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to No Vacancy, the hospitality industry's #1 podcast, with your host, Glenn Hausman, online at rouse.media, on Twitter at TravelingGlenn, and on Facebook.com/Glenn.Hausman. We'll catch you next time.